The Corvallis Budget Committee orientation meeting on April 29th, 2021 is called to order. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to hand it to Ryan for introductions.
Thanks, Sammy. Give us just a second. We're working out a technical difficulty on, I believe there's an echo. Can you just turn it down? Okay. All right, so we wanted to first go around and do introductions. And so do you want to go to the next slide? All right, so we're just going to ask you to share your role in the community or district, your history participating in a budget committee process, and one thing you hope to learn today. Again, this is a preliminary discussion on the budget. The budget won't be presented tonight or the superintendent's message related to the budget. So this is really just focused on those preliminary discussions that we can have prior to our first official budget meeting. So it does give us a chance to provide some training on budget processes and an update, but we did want to go ahead and start tonight recognizing that we have budget committee members as well as board members and district staff that we did have a chance to all introduce ourselves to one another. So I think the easiest way to do this, I've seen it done many ways over the last year, is just to call on folks and have them again introduce themselves. Are you a board member, budget committee member, your history participating in the budget committee process, and also one thing that you hope to learn today. And Bill, you happen to be the first photo or shot in my screen. So Bill, would you mind starting us off? Can you go ahead and turn yours up? All right, thanks, Bill. Next is Andrew.
Okay. My name is Andrew Freeborg. I'm a citizen member of the Budget Committee. My thing keeps telling me I'm muted, but it doesn't show it. And this is my second year being on the school district budget committee. I also served one term on the city of Corvallis budget committee. So I'm kind of getting a feel for what these things entail. And I'm just kind of looking forward to see how today goes.
Great. Thanks for being with us, Andrew. Vince.
Hi, I'm Vince Adams. I'm a member of the Corvallis School Board. This is my 8th budget cycle. And I also work at OSBA and I teach about the budget process, been doing that a lot with districts elsewhere, but you know, there's always something new to learn in the budget process. It's really complex, but I think today I'm mostly interested in revenue and thinking about, you know, what the future holds.
All right, well, hold that question. We will get to that. Jay, I know that you are available via phone right now. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. So my name is Jay Conroy. I think this is my 5th budget meeting. I think I attended one just before I was elected to my current 4-year term, and this is the end of that term. I hung around budgets a lot as a school administrator, but I don't think I ever attended a budget meeting. And I'm anxious to learn 2 things. One, how is Andrew Freeborg? Because Andrew goes back to my youngest son about 30 years ago, and I'm wanting to know how he's doing. But more importantly, no offense, Andrew, but more importantly, I'm anxious to hear the district's ideas and concerns that we need to budget for coming out of a COVID. I hang around with high school kids a little bit at my job, and I want to know what are we going to be doing for some of them that I know will be
Great. Thanks, Jay. Reese. Therese, you are frozen on my screen. You may have to turn your camera off.
Okay, how's that?
Much better.
Okay, good. I guess no camera. I keep trying, but
No, you
I
do.
just don't- it's not going to happen. I'm Therese Jones. I'm one of the school board members for Corvallis. History in budget processes. This will be my 5th budget with Corvallis School District. It'll be my it's budgets all the way around everywhere right now. Budgets with LBCC. I really enjoyed the budget process. I feel like it's a great way to think about how we're going to express with our dollars the commitment that we've made to our community through our goals, and to see those come together. And so I'm excited. I know we're not going to do a lot of that part today, but I feel like we're going to lay the groundwork for what that casting that vision to the community will look like. And so I'm excited to kick that off.
Great, thank you. And one of our newest budget committee members, Sravia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sravia. I'm a principal employment advisor at Community Services Consortium. This is my first time doing a budget committee. I used to work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where I helped with budget proposals, but it's very different. So I'm definitely excited to learn more about this process. And I'm particularly interested in learning about how the budget gets developed before it gets handed to us. So what that process looks like from the schools and the departments, and where those numbers come from, and how they show up in terms of policies.
Great. Well, welcome to the team. Margaret.
My name is Margaret Foss. I'm a citizen member on the committee. I'm just starting my 2nd term as a budget committee member. I'm like Jay, I'm really interested in learning what's going to happen because of COVID, how things are going to be different.
Welcome back. Thanks for being here. Melissa.
Hello, everybody. I'm Melissa Harder, the Assistant Superintendent here in Corvallis. And this is only my 2nd year in this job, so it's only my 2nd year in this kind of budget process. But I have been around school budgets since I started as an administrator in the district in 2007.
And next on my screen is Josh.
Hi all, I'm Josh Clark. This is my 3rd year, I think, to be on the board as a citizen member, or on the committee as a citizen member. So as for what I would like to learn today, I'd just like to meet everybody and see who all's on the committee. I see a lot of friendly faces and some new ones, so I just enjoy seeing the group. And also, we probably won't cover it much today, but I'm interested to see how COVID has changed the budget and how that's different now.
Thanks, Josh. Lahui.
Hi everyone, Luhui Whiteberry, she, her pronouns. I am on the Corvallis School Board. This is my 2nd year in a budget process for a school district, but I have quite a bit of experience with budget processes from a higher ed perspective and a tribal higher ed perspective, which is a little bit, I think on the other side of it, it's a little bit different than being on this side for sure, but understanding all the pieces that go into budgeting decisions from that perspective. And I think one thing I hope to learn today is, in addition, I think all of us are a little bit curious as to the COVID impact kind of questions, but I think in addition to that, it's more about the curiosities that the new configured committee has about the budget process and what they're bringing into it.
Great, thank you. And Catherine.
I'm Catherine Bremser. I'm on the budget committee as a citizen member. I think this is my 8th budget. And I'm interested in seeing where we are with revenue projections.
Great, thanks again for being here and your length of service as well. Next is Tina.
I'm Tina Baker. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a member of the Corvallis School Board. I've been to several different budget meetings for the district as well as LBL. I'm just looking forward to gleaning in information that I can gather tonight and listening to everybody's perspectives and ideas. Sorry, I won't be able to join by video tonight. I just don't have the bandwidth, and I'm looking forward to tonight.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. And then Stephen.
I'm Stephen Prasosky. I work with the school district as a financial analyst in the business department and assist Olivia in preparation of the budget.
Great. Thanks again for being here, Stephen. Next, we're going to move to the folks in this room. And so we'll work through the muting and unmuting and some of those pieces. Go ahead, Olivia.
Ryan, we're not hearing Olivia.
No, not really.
Why don't I just leave mine on? Can you all hear me okay? Yep. So go ahead, Olivia, and just
Okay.
go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Olivia Myers-Book, Director of Finance and Operations for the school district. This is my 16th year participating in the school district budget process. And I'm looking forward to getting to know some of our newer budget committee members better tonight. And we have lots of information to share, so.
All right, and then Sammy.
Hello, my name is Sami Adabdrabo, school board chair. I go by he, him, his, huwa bil Arabi. And I think it is my 6th year in a budget process. My first one was during the as a budget committee, citizen committee member, and following that, I applied for the board and participated in the process since then, and also participated in my own startup budgeting. Did lots of mistakes there, and with nonprofits recently, I borrowed some of the insights and learnings of how we structure funds and accounts and the way that the district uses its budgeting to provide that as feedback for nonprofits I'm working in. So really excited about budgeting, and I share the hopes about knowing how are we pivoting and repurposing our budgeting process to respond to COVID and anticipate the fall process. And I add to it another hope, which is with the revenue forecast, since the budget is not sealed in Salem, how can we, or how can I as well advocate for appropriate funding for our school district that is sufficient in Salem, since the Ways and Means is still going through the process.
And I'm Jennifer Schroeder. I have been taking minutes for the budget committee for about 10 years, and Ryan made me introduce myself. So I'm glad y'all are here. And with that, I think we're done, right?
We are. And so we are back to, I think you have to mute. Can you hear me? Yep, okay. So we're going to move on from introductions then. Again, talking a little bit about the agenda for tonight. I alluded to it earlier before we started with introductions. But again, the purpose of the meeting tonight is really to have a preliminary discussion. We won't present the superintendent's message or the budget till the next meeting, which would be the first official budget committee meeting. But this has been a practice that we've undertaken, I think, for the last 4 years as we've moved into the budget process. Again, an opportunity for us to provide you with some information, but also staying at a fairly high level which allows us to have these preliminary discussions. So we'll talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities of a budget committee. Also, a financial update, again, with that 5-year forecast. So again, I think some of the questions I've heard, I think we're going to be able to address some of that tonight. The budget outlook. So for those of you, as Sammy alluded to, who are continuing to advocate some information for you. And then also an opportunity for discussion, questions, and requests, which allow us to, between now and the next meeting, put some information together for the budget committee in ways that help to prepare the budget committee for that first meeting. And then we continue with that process through the additional meetings after that first one. So again, that's really the agenda for tonight. So in terms of our norms, one of the things that is important to do with any committee that's coming together, especially a committee that's coming together in this format, really for the second year in a row, just to go over some of those norms that we anticipate continuing to follow. Really having a focused use of meeting time. So again, we are going to provide you with some information tonight, but we're also providing you with information that will help you for future meetings. So again, we're trying to front load you with some information that you'll need. Orderly procedures. Again, one of the things that we know is important when we're meeting in this format is plenty of wait time. So making sure that if somebody has a question, that we put some wait time before respondents or between questions so that we're able to track and also make sure that everybody has a chance to participate. Another thing that we've talked about in the past has been those considerations of staff and district capacity and resource. So when those requests come forward to us for additional information, we ask that you also consider just the scope of work for staff as they are working busily to prepare for the upcoming school year. So that's just another consideration we'd like for you to have. And then finally, again, this one has been well established over time with this group, but respectful deliberation and conversation. So again, making sure that we're able to get our questions answered, and we're also able to hear the perspective of others and take those into account as we make good decisions for the youth of Corvallis.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. I'm going to cover some basic overview regarding the budget process, and the roles and responsibilities of the budget committee. Just by starting off, I wanted to just go over the process real quick with some of the key dates that are relevant to this year's budget process. The budget is a continuous operation. I know this is the time of year when we have a lot of meetings and formalities regarding the budget, but in reality, it is something that we're working on all year round. We start with preparing the budget, and so that's really the phase that we're in right now. And then once the budget is ready to go, the first thing we'll do is publish a notice of the budget committee meetings. And our official budget committee meetings are scheduled for May 20th and May 27th. So the budget committee will meet and hear the budget message and hear public comment. And at that time, the budget document, the proposed budget document, will be distributed and becomes a public record. Just as a reminder, budget committee members cannot get together in person, by phone, or email before the advertised meeting to discuss the budget. And all budget discussions must be held at public meetings. So after the initial meeting on May 20th, if needed, the budget committee may meet as many times as needed to revise and approve the budget. And when the budget committee is satisfied with the proposed budget, including any additions to or deletions from the one prepared by the district, the budget is approved. If the budget requires a property tax to be in balance, which our budget does, the Budget Committee will also approve an amount and rate of property tax to be certified to our county assessor. So once the Budget Committee approves the budget, our school board holds a budget hearing where citizens are able to make public comment on the approved budget. Before that budget hearing, we'll publish a summary of the budget that's been approved by the Budget Committee. And then finally, the budget is adopted. The board is scheduled to meet on June 10th to hold both the budget hearing and adopt the budget. And at that time, the board will enact a resolution to formally adopt the budget, make appropriations, and levy and categorize our taxes. Obviously, the budget is the basis for making appropriations and certifying our tax levy. And that resolution must be adopted by June 30th. And then the final step in the formal budget cycle is to certify our property tax levies to our county assessor on or before July 15th. So that's kind of the technical process and how the Budget Committee role is played during that process. The main function of the Budget Committee is to meet and review, discuss, make additions or deletions, and approve the proposed budget in a series of public meetings. So the Budget Committee should hear the budget message, hear and consider public comment, discuss and revise the budget as needed, approve the budget, and then approve the tax rate and levy amount. Some of the things that the Budget Committee doesn't do, the Budget Committee doesn't set salaries, benefits, or contract terms, set staffing levels or organization structure decisions, decide if a program or service should be provided, or make or alter district goals or policies. So tonight's meeting is kind of considered an informal pre-meeting of the Budget Committee. And there are some kind of specific requirements about what the Budget Committee can do at this type of meeting and what has to wait until after or until our first official Budget Committee meeting. So this kind of gives an overview of the topics that we can discuss, so we can provide some training on the process and our budget calendar and expectations, preferences for the committee and how you want to run the meetings, orientation on the district, orientation on our budget document, general discussion of goals and spending priorities, general economic projections, and current or prior year budgets. So we'll be discussing several of those topics today. Some of the things we won't be getting into today, and we won't until our first official budget meeting on May 20th, is talking about specific estimates or appropriation amounts, whether the district is funding specific programs or expenditures, and whether the district will impose a tax levy or an amount of tax levy. So those are kinds of things that must wait until after we publish notice of the first meeting and the Budget Committee receives the budget message and has a meeting to hold public comment. So next up, I just want to provide a quick financial update for everyone. This just is really to provide a summary of the last few years and what's been happening and what the current year looks like, and starting just with some basic facts and figures, looking at students, staff, and spending at a glance. This graph represents our student enrollment over the last few years, and you can see that in the current school year, we did experience an enrollment loss like many other districts in the state. Our enrollment wasn't necessarily growing or decreasing at any sort of rapid rate. Prior to the pandemic, our enrollment was pretty flat and only changed by 0.3%. Our enrollment decreased by about 325 students this year, which is just under 5% of what our enrollment was last year. Looking at grade by grade level, what we did notice was that we experienced the most enrollment loss at grades K through 5. And so just to kind of demonstrate that, so prior to the pandemic, our K-5 enrollment has actually grown by 1.4%. And between last year and this year, it actually decreased by 5.8%. So that is where we saw the most impact in terms of our enrollment loss as a result of the pandemic. When we look at our staffing levels, it's a pretty steady trend. Our staffing levels have increased every year for the last 5 years by almost 19%. And those staffing increases have happened across all of our employee groups. And so you could see that we've increased our licensed FTE by 57, our classified FTE has increased by 68, and our administrative and non-represented employees have increased by 5. So we've added staffing across all areas and functions of the district. And when we kind of combine those two things together and we look at our student enrollment and our staffing, obviously our staffing's increased, but our enrollment's been pretty static and is now decreasing. And so that represents a much lower student staff ratio than what we've seen in prior years. I went back to look at what our projected enrollment was for this year, and using that figure, our student staff ratio would have been 8.0 had our enrollment come in as expected. And so obviously the drop this year wasn't anticipated, but I do want to note that even though our enrollment was less than what we projected, we didn't reduce any staffing this year. And so this kind of represents the results of that. When we look at our general fund revenues and expenditures, overall, over the last 5 years, our general fund expenditures have slightly outpaced our growth in revenues. And so each year looks a little different. The first 3 years of this chart represent years in which our revenues exceeded or were pretty close to what we were spending. You can see in 2019-20, in last fiscal year, we spent quite a bit more than what we had brought in. And that was somewhat intentional. We had some excess reserves that we had set aside, knowing that our PERS rates were going to be increasing significantly last year. And then you can see this year, the projection actually looks pretty flat. Our projected operating surplus this year is really small, maybe about $250,000 to $300,000. So we're pretty much operating at a flat number this year, which wasn't expected. Obviously, we've got some savings happening as a result of the pandemic. And I kind of want to show what our general fund adopted budget looked like and what our current projection looks like. So the top of this chart shows our original projected revenues. Our adopted budget was $88.3 million. Our current projection is $80.8 million. So obviously our revenues have decreased significantly. There were several factors for that. One of the biggest factors was that our student investment account revenue was originally budgeted in the general fund, and that's been moved into a grant fund as defined by the state. And so that was a pretty big chunk, almost, that was $5.4 million. So the biggest change really was just in changing the way we were accounting for the student investment account grant. But our revenues were also impacted by obviously lower than projected enrollment. We actually experienced a small increase in our local option taxes. But when you look at the spending, we've gone from $88.6 million to $80.6. And there's a lot of factors happening there too. And most of that is related to the pandemic. We're experiencing some savings in some of our operational costs related to staffing. So we had quite a few vacant positions in the fall that were not filled right away. Some of those we've been filling in the last couple of months, but there were some savings related to vacancies. We experienced some savings related to our contracted student transportation services. We do have language in our agreement with our transportation provider that we pay a minimum cost, but when we weren't running buses in the fall, we did experience some savings there. We also have seen significantly lower costs related to substitutes, travel, and professional learning. Obviously, a lot of those activities are sort of on hold right now. And so overall, when we look at our general fund spending, we're projecting our underspending this year to be about 6.25%. So that means that when we look at our budgeted spending and our actual spending, we think we're gonna spend 93.75% of our budget. And normally we spend about 98% of our budget. And so that is a pretty big adjustment. We saw some similar results from last year as well, but in a much shorter time frame and a smaller amount. So that's kind of an overview of where we're at financially with the current year. And this is a snapshot of our general fund reserves over the last several years. And you can see that there was some significant growth in 2017-18 and 18-19. And there was the planned spend down that happened in 19-20. And so for 2021, we are projected to end the year at about 12.9 million. And so we are still above the level that's required by our board policy. So that's good. And that's helpful as we move into next year, which I'm going to talk about now. I think this is what some people are curious about. So there's a lot of bars on this chart, but this is a high-level overview of our general fund revenues and expenditures, not just for what you saw previously projected through this year, but also projected for the next 5 years. And it's a similar trend in that our projected spending continues to outpace our projected growth in revenues. And so that's obviously something we're concerned about. This is a look at our student enrollment projections. So you can see in 2021, where we had a dip this year, we're projecting to recapture 50% of the enrollment loss that we experienced this year. So that is a big unknown for us. But you can see moving forward, our enrollment is really projected to remain either flat and or slightly decrease over the next 5 years. And this is a snapshot of what our state school fund allocations have looked like over the last several years. So the state school fund allocation at the state level is made every biennium. And so we're in the second year of a biennium right now, the 2019-21 biennium. So we're really focused on what's happening for the 21-23 biennium. And you can see here in this chart, the projection for next year, based on a $9.1 billion state school fund allocation, is quite a big decrease from what we are currently receiving. And you can see just even with the trend over the last few years, it's not something we've experienced in a while. So that's something we're definitely interested in and curious about and wanting to advocate at the state level. There's a lot of conversations around school funding, and there's obviously a lot of other factors at play right now with regard to other resources. But when it comes to our state school fund, this really does show that we would actually be receiving less revenue next year from the state school fund if the legislature approves a $9.1 billion appropriation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts of everything. It's not as exciting as a graph, but it's all the numbers from our 5-year forecast. And so you can see in the current year, the 2021 projected column just covers everything we had talked about, what our projected Indian fund balance looks like, that as a percent of our total revenues. We pay attention to that because of our board policy. So when we look at our policy, we know that all of the reserves that are required in the policy add up to 12.5% of revenues. And so that's kind of the number we always strive to achieve. So you can see in all of the future years of this forecast, our spending is more than our revenues. We're operating at a deficit. We use up all of our excess reserves in the first year of the projection. And then the area that's outlined in red represents corrective action required. So essentially that means those are the reductions that would need to be made for us to end the year with a fund balance that meets the board policy requirements. So at this point in time, when we think about our general fund for next year, we know that we're going to have to make some adjustments. And we're especially concerned about the second year of the biennium and even the future biennium, the 23-25 biennium, because we won't have any excess reserves to offset any of these deficits, and we'll need to continue to make some corrective action in order to achieve a balanced budget. So my crystal ball is a little cloudy these days, but when we talk about budget development, the first thing we go to is our district vision and our board goals. So obviously our board goals are really what guide us in developing our action plan or our proposed budget each year. We also have a set of budget parameters that the board adopts, and they're listed here. And these are just general guidelines that we intend to honor through our budget process. So these set forth the ideals that the decision makers in the district will adhere to as they develop the budget, through an understanding that these decisions have long-term consequences. So budget parameters are important for sharing or creating a shared understanding of the overarching values that underpin budget development. And unlike our district's fiscal policies, which tend to be technical, budget parameters can ideally be understood and appreciated by all stakeholders, including the public. So our budget parameters cover a large area, but we really start with our goals for student outcomes driving the budget process. Obviously, our first board goal is tied to student achievement. So there's a lot of alignment there. We also have a parameter to provide every student with equitable access and opportunities. Again, alignment with our board goals. We strive to base decisions on data. That's been harder this year just because there is a significant absence of data right now. And that's one of the conversations we're having as we move forward. We want to base our decisions around resources on the total value created for students. We want to get the best bang for our buck. We want to continue to look at patterns of spending, identify areas when we compare ourselves to maybe other districts. Are there areas where we spend on average a lot more or a lot less? Just starting to look for some analysis of potential areas to further analyze. We obviously want to take a long-term perspective. That's really important right now as we work through the budget process. And last but not least, we want to be transparent along the way. So I want to come back to the state school fund allocation, because in terms of resources for our general fund, this is really the hot topic, the big unknown, the biggest driving factor of our budget. And I know I showed what our forecast looks like, and we're basing that on a $9.1 billion state school fund allocation. The governor's proposed budget that came out in December included a $9.1 billion allocation, and the co-chairs of the Ways and Means Committee released their budget framework a couple of months ago, and it also included a $9.1 billion state school fund allocation. So we believe that is too low. We agree with our colleagues around the state that really what we need is a $9.6 billion allocation to maintain our current service level. I want to demonstrate what that looks like by taking that chart that we were looking at earlier and sort of reworking it and looking at the next biennium 3 different times based on 3 different funding levels. So the first section is the same numbers that we saw before, where based on a $9.1 billion state school fund allocation and maintaining our reserves at the board policy level, we will have to make some adjustments in our general fund to maintain a balanced budget. If the state school fund allocation was $9.3 billion, we'd still have to make some adjustments in our general fund budget, but they wouldn't be as drastic, particularly in the first year. And you can see this clearly provides evidence that at $9.6 billion, you finally see that corrective action go to zero. So for us just to maintain our current service level, it would take $9.6 billion for us not to make any reductions in our general fund. So a big part of the conversation, sometimes that comes up with regard to the state school fund, is all the other sources of revenue that we're receiving. But really what's important, the state school fund is our primary ongoing source of revenue. A lot of the funds we're receiving outside of our general fund are not ongoing sources of revenue. So our biggest concern really is more about the next 5 to 6 years and not necessarily about right now. I mean, we know we're able to serve our students and serve their needs right now. But if the state school fund allocation ends up being $9.1 billion this year, it's just going to require us to make up so much ground the next time the legislature comes together. And so that's a big concern for us. With regard to our other non-general fund state and federal resources, I want to cover 3 of those today. Some of these are going to be new for some people, and maybe you haven't heard of them all. Starting with the Student Investment Account, or the SIA. So the Student Investment Account was created as a result of the Student Success Act. This current year, the 2021 school year, is the first year where we've received Student Investment Account funds. The positive around the Student Investment Account is that it was not impacted as significantly by the pandemic as what was originally predicted at the state level. So the SIA is funded through corporate activity tax, and those revenues have continued to improve with each economic forecast. So that's good news, and that means that we will receive additional resources next fiscal year through the Student Investment Account. There are restrictions in how we can use these funds. There's 4 allowable areas, but this is an area where many districts are looking at in terms of the general fund deficits that they're projecting for next year. And unfortunately, if we're using our Student Investment Account funds to basically continue current service level costs, the Student Success Act really isn't panning out as the state had intended it to. So we're hoping that we don't have to do that. With regard to the federal funds, there's been 3 different allocations through the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or the ESSER, or ESSER. We have so many acronyms in K-12, and we just add more and more each week. So the ESSER 1 allocation, the district received around this time last year. Those were one-time funds. We received about $800,000, and we've spent all of those funds this year, primarily on PPE, increasing custodial time, and mostly dealing with health and safety related aspects of addressing or responding to the pandemic. ESSER 2 is an allocation from a federal allocation that was approved back in December. We just received our award notification of those funds last week. They're also one-time funds. We are receiving about $2.9 million through that ESSER 2 allocation. We think we'll spend approximately $1 million of that between now and June 30th of this fiscal year. And so we will have some of those funds remaining for us to use next year. Those funds are available to use through September 30th, 2023. The ESSER 3 allocation, again, one-time funds through the federal government as a result of the American Recovery Plan. This one is a big one. We're expecting to receive about $6.4 million. We're still awaiting an official allocation and an award. Those funds will be available through September 30th, 2024. So obviously we're receiving a lot of funds through the federal government. There are there are some restrictions on eligible uses of those funds. We aren't spending as much of those funds on addressing the health and safety aspects of the pandemic. We did that a lot with the first two allocations, but we'll be using a lot of the ESSER 3 funds to talk about or to address unfinished instruction. And that'll be the primary way we spend those funds. The last thing that's sort of still percolating at the state level are summer learning grants. And so the legislature hasn't approved these funds yet, but they are expected to. These will be one-time funds, and the district is expected to receive about $2.9 million. And there will be 3 different grants, one that's focused on credit recovery for students in grades 9 through 12. One will be focused on academic enrichment and learning for students in grades K through 8. And we will also be the recipient of a child care grant, which we can use to partner with community organizations so that our students can not only participate in the summer programs, but also have childcare available for them during that time as well. So kind of going back to the impact of the pandemic and sort of where we're at with planning for next year. This really kind of represents a high-level overview of how we're trying to develop a budget for next year with all these different resources at play, and knowing we're dealing with a lot of things. So this is really like a multiple pandemic situation for us. We're facing a lot of challenges. Unfinished instruction is a big one. Social isolation and trauma, systematic inequities, fiscal uncertainty. So all of these things are happening all at the same time. And so we're really trying to create some structure around where we're prioritizing our resources and planning efforts. And so we're focusing on 3 areas. The first is adapting learning. So talking about how we're going to measure and address unfinished instruction, prioritize our students who have historically been marginalized, enhancing instruction and blending learning. We're also focusing on serving the whole child, prioritizing mental health, strengthening social and emotional learning, and providing other wraparound services. And the last is reorienting our resources. Some of this is more technical, but really talking about reorganizing staff and schedules, rethinking professional learning, and making some necessary investments related to technology and air quality when it comes to our facilities. And so that's a really high-level summary of the areas that we're focusing on with regard to budget development. And I'm going to stop talking now and see if there are questions or a discussion that anyone wants to have, or if there are requests for information. I think we can open that up. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing real quick. Andrew does have his hand raised. Hi, Andrew.
Hello. So what is the primary driver right now of the expenditures exceeding revenues for basically the foreseeable future?
I'd say in the current year, it was having to accept a loss of enrollment without decreasing our staffing levels. And, you know, like our best practice would say that if we're serving 325 less kids, we would make some reductions in staff to maintain, you know, a class size that we had in the prior year. So we do have a low ratio right now, and we do have really low class sizes right now. So the challenge moving forward is we're going to have to move on from that hold harmless mentality, which is hard to do when we know that needs are really great. But we're sort of needing to reconcile our staffing levels with the actual number of students we're expecting to see. Part of that is building a lot of flexibility in our budget because our enrollment projection is, this has probably been the hardest year to project enrollment for next year. And we're just trying to make sure that we have flexibility in the budget to respond. Like if the enrollment comes in higher than what we had anticipated, we want to be able to deploy those additional resources right away. So we spend the majority of our budget on salaries and benefits. And so the level of staffing is the biggest driver there, and also the increases, the annual increases in salaries and benefits, and in doing what we can to control those as much as possible. Did that answer your question? Okay.
One thing I would add to what Olivia shared was that we feel like that is a pretty conservative estimate in terms of students returning. We know that many of our students did not leave and go into online schools elsewhere. I think many of our students were, as we look at grade level by grade level, many of those students are kindergartners, and we also recognize that many of those students went into homeschool. And so I anticipate students returning, and we feel like that was a pretty conservative mark for us because we wanted to be able to be responsive, but also recognizing enrollment is a key driver in the resources that we have.
Yeah, Josh, you have your hand up. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. First, I really appreciate the presentation. It's really, I think, well put together and really informative. One question I had, I'm not sure if there's an answer, but for these projections that you make for expenditures in the budget, what are your assumptions about the pandemic? Is it a business as usual, or is it, I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit as far as the assumptions in that.
Sure. Yeah, with regard to the general fund and projecting next year and out further, it is kind of more of a business as usual. We're looking to utilize the one-time federal funds to address those one-time needs that are related to the pandemic, although I would debate that receiving funds for 1 or 2 years is probably not necessarily the, that might be more of a minimum and not necessarily everything we would need. So the general fund is really kind of business as usual. We look at historically how the cost per FTE and how that's changed over time. And so our assumptions around spending projections is that our salaries increase by 3.5% every year. So that's for employees who are eligible for an experience step. We assume that they'll receive those, and then some modest COLAs. The experience steps alone they range for different employee groups anywhere from 1.5% up to 3.7%. We also assume when it comes to non-compensation expenditures, so just like our purchase services, our utilities, transportation costs, things like that, those tend to go up each year, not by huge amounts, but usually some small increments. And so we assume a 2% increase in those expenditures from one year to the next, with the exception of our student transportation contract. That is a multi-year contract, and the escalation factor in that contract is 2.5%. So for that one, we look at it separately, but for anything that's not salaries and benefits, we assume a 2% increase.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Oh, Sammy's got his hand up. I'll mute myself.
So Olivia, thank you. I have two questions. Number one, there seems to be a proposal at the legislature about increasing the weight associated with students experiencing poverty in the ADMW. How would that change the calculation for us? And would that be favorable? I would assume it is. And I'll ask my second question after.
I think if the weighting was increased for students navigating poverty at the state level, I don't know that we would benefit that much from that. Really, that wouldn't benefit us unless the pie got bigger, right? Our piece of the pie probably, wouldn't increase. Our overall percent of students navigating poverty is not above average when we look at districts across the state. And so we would benefit, but only if the allocation itself was increased.
Second question, and please tell me if I'm going into details that we should talk about later on, but the investments in technology that we had before PPE, etc. I'm really particularly interested in technology and Corvallis Online. How did it happen, or what were the sources of revenue in this year, and what are the assumptions for that we will look for in the coming year?
Sure. So we used some of our ESSER 1 allocation to cover the cost of the online curriculum that we used for the Corvallis online program this year. And we also used some of our ESSER 1 funds to provide some additional training to our staff and professional learning around using technology. And so we did use some of our federal funds to go towards that program. We're actually having a lot of conversations at the moment about what a continuation of that option looks like into next year. I believe there's a conversation at the state level happening as well, and whether districts will be required to maintain an option for students who may not be able to return to in-person learning in the fall. And so those are conversations we're having and having to work through a lot of those details. But primarily in terms of the technology investments, the majority of that went into the actual online curriculum purchases. I don't see any other questions at the moment.
So this year, obviously, there was increased spending in certain areas, particularly due to COVID in terms of cleaning and all of that. What spending do you think is going to stay in the next year? And is there any spending that you think is going to go away or be decreased?
I think some of the spending around cleaning and sanitizing will stay. A lot of the initial startup and implementation of that, we won't have to deal with. But there will be sort of some ongoing costs related to that. And we also increased our custodial staff. And so just the nature that there's more work to do, and we'll probably need to maintain that for a period of time. And it's kind of hard to say for how long still, right? We purchased a lot of PPE with our ESSER 1 funds this year. And again, it's kind of hard to say, will we need to continue to replenish those supplies? We anticipate we may need to, but we don't necessarily know for how long we would need to do that. And so I think where we're focusing a lot of our efforts right now are how we can modify the use of our facilities to allow for extra spacing. I don't know if anyone's been to any of our schools lately. You might have noticed there's a bunch of tents going up outside in the lawn, on the lawns, just trying to provide more space for students to be able to stay socially distanced, but still, you know, maintain some normal activities like eating lunch and having recess, and in even some cases having classes outside. So it's kind of hard to answer that question. And I kind of feel like each week we're presented with a new challenge to solve. And so I think it's hard to say how much of those funds will go towards like the health and safety, the cleaning and sanitizing and PPE related expenditures. I wouldn't say zero, but I think it's hard for us to project that at this point in time, not knowing how long we would need to continue some of those practices. Josh has another question.
Yeah, one more question. You can tell me if this is irrelevant. I know that we're building new school buildings, which is great for the district. With these projections, are there any funds coming from the general fund over time that will be used to, say, outfit these buildings, et cetera? Like, is that all outside of the general fund and a separate discussion, 100%?
Yeah, we're not anticipating spending any general fund dollars on like furnishings, fixtures, and equipment, stuff like that. That will all come from bond proceeds. And at this point in time, we're not up against any sort of fiscal restraint on the bond. We're at this point in time, we feel like we'll be able to fulfill all the bond promises with the resources that we have in the bond program. So that's the one positive, is that when the school is built, it won't be empty inside or have a bunch of old furniture in it. So I think
Awesome.
There's a bright spot.
Awesome, great to hear.
Bill, you are muted. He's not muted? Bill, you don't show as being muted, but we can't hear you. Okay. I'm gonna have Jennifer get in touch with you, Bill, to try to get your audio going, okay? And Jay has a question. We'll go to Jay and then we'll come back to Bill so we don't forget about him.
Olivia, thank you for the presentation. Would you be able to send us maybe a brief 4 or 5 sentence statement about each of those federal resources, how much they are and what limitations and what time frame they can be used?
Sure.
That would be kind of a nice guide for where we might see ourselves using them, or you using them.
I can do that.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
I guess I'm not sure this directly connects to the overall forecast situation, but can you explain a little bit about how the district designs the budget on their end? Do the schools provide a proposal or estimates, or is this more district departmental? How does that budget get formulated?
Sure, I can provide an overview. There's multiple facets to that. We kind of look at it in 2 different ways. We have school budgets and we have department budgets. Our departments submit proposals, and we make them, I'm sure Melissa will be like, we make our departments build zero-based budgets each year. So they don't receive an allocation, and we don't just roll those budgets forward from one year to the next. So each of our departments puts together a proposal from the ground up based on needs for the following year. For our schools, we give them multiple allocations. We give them staffing allocations in which they can use to staff for certified and classified positions. We also give our schools discretionary funds, so dollars that they can spend however they want. And so our schools receive an allocation for classroom FTE. They receive an allocation for basic school support FTE, which is really kind of covers all of the basic elements of a school operation. So everything from the principal and the office manager to your counselors and educational assistants and all the people working in the building that aren't, direct classroom teachers. Our schools also receive discretionary allocations, and so we provide our schools with weighted allocations based on projected enrollment, and we give them extra weights for students that are navigating poverty, emerging bilinguals, students with disabilities, and students who are showing opportunity for growth. And so our schools use those funds in various different ways. Sometimes they use those funds to purchase additional staff, but that's really up to each school. So we sort of, roll out these allocations in February, March of each year, and they spend time reconciling their budgets, is what we call that, and which is that process just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago. So that's kind of why we're in that stage of sort of putting everything together. It's like putting a puzzle together and making everything fit and making it work. We're following up with Bill by phone to see what kind of questions he had. Are there any other questions? Okay, any other topics for discussion or requests for information? Oh, we have questions from Bill.
Okay. He wants to know if we have refinanced our tax
Okay.
exempt bonds because of the interest rates, the available interest rates. You said it much better than I did. Is that your question, Bill? Yes.
So Bill's asking if the district has refinanced our tax exempt bonds because interest rates are very favorable right now. The answer to that question is no, we have not. And I don't have a lot of information on that, but I can get more information on that and follow up with you, Bill, by talking to our bond counsel and our bond underwriters to see if that's something that we'd want to pursue. So I'll follow up with you on that one, Bill. So I got that on my list, and I've got a cheat sheet of all of these non-general fund resources, what they are, how we can use them, how much we're getting, all of that. Okay. Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we are scheduled to meet for our first official budget meeting on Thursday, May 20th. We will be publishing notice of that meeting ahead of time. And at that meeting, the budget committee will elect officers for the year. And hear the superintendent's budget message and take public comment and begin deliberations on the proposed budget. We always try to have that document to the committee in advance of that meeting. This is probably the hardest year where we've been up against so many challenges, and I'm not as confident as I normally would be in that we could get that to you in advance. I do think we'll be able to get it to you before the meeting. I just don't know how many days before the meeting. So we'll continue to keep you posted on that. And once we kind of have a better idea of when we expect that to be ready, we'll let you know, and then coordinate with everyone on how to get a copy, whether you want an electronic copy or hard copy. We will work with you and even work with you to get it in your hands if you want a hard copy as well. So stay tuned for more on that. I don't know if Ryan, you want to wrap it up or have any last words before we recess?
Oh, you're muted.
And you have to. Again, just thank you for your willingness to participate in this process. It is an important process for us to go through with all of you, and to our community members or our community participants. Thank you for being on the budget committee. It's again, it's an important way that we show transparency in terms of the work that we're doing and the way we're spending our resources. So with that, I look forward to seeing you for our next meeting and the opportunity to share the superintendent's budget message with you.
All right, we'll recess and we'll see you on the 20th. Thank you.